Yeah, you can go ahead with the presentation, Marian.
John, we couldn't hear you.
You couldn't hear me?
No.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you now if you want to kind of rewind and give your spiel.
John, are you speaking?
Well, hi, everybody. I'm not sure if John's having technical problems or not, but I know we can hear Marian. So Marian, why don't you go ahead and make sure you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself before you start your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Lori. My name is Marian Tandoh Wordey, and I'm speaking from Ghana. And I am the Agricultural Value Chain and Market Linkages Advisor for Canada, Global Affairs Canada, on the MAG program in Ghana. The MAG program is modernizing agriculture in Ghana. And what I do mostly is to help the value chain actors within the various commodities, whether cereals, fruits and vegetables, roots and tuber, fish and oils, and also tree crops. And I wear two hats actually, because I partner an agribusiness consultancy firm that also help agribusinesses in transforming their businesses right from the farm to the table. All right, thank you. The topic for today is evaluating agriculture and agribusiness transformation through private sector involvement in driving community value chains in sub-Saharan Africa. And as you can see on the board, you see the indigenous agriculture where we're using hoes and cutlass to work. And you see the modern agriculture where we are using tractors to prepare lands for agriculture. Now, the outline of my presentation would be the objective of this presentation, the background as in the commodity value chains in Africa, and then private involvement in agriculture and agribusiness. Then I look at the types of transformation that has occurred within the sector and the role that the private sector played in transforming agriculture and the lessons learned. The objective of this presentation is actually to highlight the importance of private sector in driving commodity chains in sub-Saharan Africa. Now you can see that agriculture makes up about 20% of sub-Saharan Africa's economy, which is quite higher than any other region worldwide. And by so doing, you can tell that agriculture presents the greatest opportunity for the continent. Now, when you come to the commodities value chains in agriculture in Africa, we can talk of a lot of them: potatoes, cassava, rice, tomatoes, maize, but we have yam having about 97% of the world's production, and then cassava having 63% of the world's production. Now, when you're looking at the private sector forms about 80% of the midstream of the value chains, and they are the ones who serve as a vehicle on which these value chains thrive. And we'll say that they are the connection between the farmer and the retailer or the consumer. So they provide the direct support in terms of transport services, mechanization, warehousing, aggregation facilities, and processing units. So I would say that they form the engine through which agriculture thrives. Now, for purpose of this presentation, I'll look at commodity cassava, the value chain of cassava, and how private sector has been able to thrive, help these value chain thrive. So we're going to evaluate the contribution of the private sector in making sure that this value chain thrives. So right now, for cassava value chain, you look at the pre-planting, we come to the production, logistics, processing, marketing, and consumption. So the private sector normally forms within the production, the logistics, processing, and the markets. Now, cassava, we know, is a well-known product, commodity, but it's not known in the Western world. But it is worthy to know that it feeds about 8 million people globally. This is from the FAO statistics for 2019. In West Africa, it is a staple food. That is what we eat. And previously, it was seen as a poor man's food because it has, people were thinking that we had planted it a lot, and if we are poor, that is what we eat. But that has changed. Now it has metamorphosized into an industrial crop. And this is as a result of research, scientific research findings, which has come out with its various utilization. Now we are looking at what kind of transformation has occurred within this agriculture value chain. When you look at this picture, you see that cassava has been able to be transformed into cassava chips, and it can also be transformed into starch, and then ethanol, as well as tapioca starch, and even tapioca food. We have cassava being transformed into foods that are being exported for the diasporan market, those who eat West African foods. When you look at the markets, we'll see that there has been an extension of market. There has been increased market access for both local and export market. So you see that we have the flour milling and bakery, we have the biscuits industry, we have the plywood industry, we have the traditional foods industry, we have the breweries, as well as the pharmaceuticals, the textiles, the paint, the confectionaries, and glucose syrup. So it has increased very much so that we now have access to even export markets. Now, with this, you see a lot of these private sectors that have formed companies to mop up these cassava to be able to produce the various commodities that I've mentioned. So you have Polycraft for plywood and cartons, you have Submiller Ghana and Guinness Ghana, also taking up the brewery section. Now, in terms of transformation into finance, we have quite a number of banks who are supporting agriculture and agribusinesses. We have the Exim Bank, we have the Agrowa Value Chain Fund, we have the Agricultural Development Bank Fund, we have Development Bank of Ghana, and this is just a few of them. There has been a lot of transformation in terms of funding agriculture in Ghana, agriculture and agribusinesses in Ghana. And there is also access to technology and innovations. Currently, there is a lot of innovations in terms of agriculture. There are agri-technologies, and when you pick a company like Farmerline, they provide information through the tablets and even having GPS coordinates for farms and providing information for the farmer in terms of yields, in terms of commodities, in terms of fertilizer usages. And in fact, we even have mechanization, that is the tractor, also providing that information for farmers. Now, when you come to logistics, we have more investment in the value chain. We have the warehousing, we have the mechanization, we have the haulage, and we have the logistics. All these transformations have happened within the sub-Saharan Africa. And Ghana is just a case, but it happens everywhere. It is the same. Now, you look at what kind of contribution or the role of the private sector for these transformations. You see that when it comes to value addition, where I mentioned that it has now metamorphosed into a production of industrial raw materials like starch, like ethanol, like chips for animal feed production, and for exports of those who are producing breweries and the rest. You can tell that from 2010, which was during the about more than 13 years ago, we had just a few number of large processors, that is 3 of them, who were producing starch and cassava as in food products for the local consumption. Now it has transformed into, from 2023, we are having more than 16 companies, 4 milling companies, 6 ethanol companies. We have the 2 brewery companies, 2 starch companies, 5 chips companies for export and for poultry production. And then we have more than 36 medium-scale processors for cassava. And all these are done by private sector. We have only one government sector, which is being supported by a private sector as well. And so we could tell that the private sector has actually taken up the research findings and the research development and brought it into actual production. When you look at the market expansion, because of the various commodities that have been derivatives of the cassava that has been produced, it has opened up markets. It has opened up a lot of market opportunities for farmers and for the value chain actors. And when you look at the calculations, when you come to ethanol, we have about 103 million liters deficit, and that is demand of cassava ethanol. And then when you come to the breweries, we have 8,000 metric tons of cassava flour to be churned into beer. We have, when you come to the milling industry, we have 30,000, and you come to the biscuit noodles, all come together, we have 50,000. You come to cassava to be used for pastries and bread for the school feeding institutions, you are looking at 6,000. The paperboard looking at 42,500. And in all, you can tell that cassava has actually been able to expand markets, and it has given market access to farmers and all the people within the value chain. Now, access to funding. Prior to this year, or prior to 2022, funding agricultural produce was nothing to write home about. It's either micro funding by themselves or having the outgrowers or farmers coming together to do basket funding, where each person pulls out at the end of the month or at the end of the week for supporting their farms. Now you have all the commercial farmers ready to fund agriculture. The reason being that it has been private sector led, and these private sector led kind of give these funding houses the support to be able to have a little risk associated to the funding. And so you have all the commercial funding ready to give. You have project funding coming out. You have outgrower funding also supporting, and you have government also supporting SMEs who are into agribusinesses and agriculture. Now, we would say that why would they do that? What I would say is that the SMEs are SMEs who have registered outgrowers and have off-taker agreements with them. And then what they do is to have a tripartite agreement where you have the rural banks providing the funding, you have the SME providing the mechanization and other input supplies for the farmers. And then at the end of the day, when everything is done, when it is harvested, the SME buys off the farmer's produce, and then he uses whatever money he used in paying for the input as a barter to take off some of the produce. And this makes it easy for farmers to work with private sector in terms of having a pull effect in pulling them to access funding or access markets. Now, with technology, as I indicated earlier, there's been a lot of telecommunications. Now, new private sectors have invested into irrigation. They've invested into mechanization centers. They have invested into tablets that can be used to check GPS coordinates and to be able to check various diseases and communicate prices, communicate produce that are available at one point and to the other point. And so you have a lot of innovations coming in where you have technology speaking the local dialects to farmers who we see as, in quotes, illiterates who didn't understand the, so to speak, the terms and technology language. And so we'll say that the private sector has been able to do that. We have more than 6 companies who are using these technologies to help value chain actors to access information, to take and do irrigation, to do mechanization. And some of these are Farmer Line, M-Fund, Isoko, you have 360 Agro, and the lots. So the same thing happens to all the West African countries. They go there and then it's the same everywhere. Private sector is striving to transform the agriculture and agribusiness sector. Now, when it comes to warehousing and mechanization, the private sector doesn't have the muscle to do that as doing it nationwide. But now you have the government coming in to partner, strategic partnership with private sector to be able to put up warehouses and mechanization centers at each regions or each district for farmers to have access to them. We can talk of only Olam Ghana having, which is also a private entity, having a nationwide warehouse to support farmers and agribusinesses. And so I would have, that would be something that would say that Olam also does to support the farmers and the agribusiness sector. In short, I would say that the private sector is an engine for the survival of agricultural value chains. Because when you look at all these that I've presented, all of them are private-led. You have the government coming in only at the warehousing stage, where you have PPP, private-public partnership. And then when you look at the agricultural landscape, one can tell that it needs direct investment into the large-scale farming and enterprises so that it would have a pull effect on the smallholder farmers to drive their chain sustainably. Because it is a private sector, they are profit-making venture, but the farmers need to have a bigger muscle that will pull them along to be able to have income, to be able to have a sustainable work, to be able to drive their chain such that every actor within the chain will be able to have what it takes to be in the chain. Now, what we'll say is that though the private sector is doing this, all these things, it cannot do it alone. There's the need for an enabling environment to boost these businesses and make them thrive by providing sustainable market for these farmers. Enabling environment as in giving policies that are going to benefit agriculture, providing interest-free or low interest for SMEs or farmers, or even the private sector within the chain, as in those investing in warehousing, those investing in haulage, those investing in input supplies. And then apart from that, we are looking at providing them with enough support, as in providing them with input logistics. Where they go, they will find government institutions supporting them to be able to meet up their expectations. So what I would say is that these private sector are engines that drives value chains in sub-Saharan Africa. And so they need to be taken care of. They need to be part of every value chain so that we would have the needed impact that we want to have on smallholder farmers, would have the needed impact that we want on the value chains. And it is not just cassava, we are looking at all other value chains in terms of vegetables, in terms of roots and tubers like plantain, in terms of tomatoes, especially the perishable ones. We need the private sector to help it thrive. So here is one private sector who does adhesive for paperboard production and carton production. And so they have been ready, they are ready to invest in the value chain by providing warehousing and then providing the support for any micro or medium scale processor to be able to meet the quality standards for exports. Thank you very much for your attention. I am ready for any questions that would come up.
John, I think we might still, well, you're on mute, and can you just adjust your camera a little bit because we can only see this. There you go. There you are. Can you check if you have audio? I think
he's muted.
Yeah, you're muted according to the, yeah. Can we hear you now? Well, shoot. Something is awry. We're having this terrible storm here in Michigan, as a lot of the US is, and so our university is actually closing at 1 o'clock. So we're doing this a little bit differently today. So that might be part of the problem with John's technical situation. So that said, if anybody has a question, you can either come off mute or type it in the chat for Marian. So since Marian, since this audience is mostly, looking at this from an evaluation perspective, like how do you evaluate this? And we aren't from the agricultural, at least most of it. I don't want to speak for everybody. There might be somebody on who has more expertise in agriculture. Can you speak a little bit about how lessons learned in terms of how to evaluate these kind of situation that you're speaking about, what methods or what issues one might run into in looking at this kind of thing?
Yeah, we realized I did run a project by Bill and Melinda Gates project, which is a cassava value chain project, and which was being implemented in 5 African countries: Nigeria, Malawi, Uganda, Tanzania, and Ghana. And then with UK also happened to be part of the team. We realized that after the project, when we did a baseline survey, we realized that the number of actors within the value chain were low. And as a result, the impact that we expected was not achieved that much. And so we did a baseline survey to ascertain why that was happening. And so we evaluated the whole process by collecting data, both primary and secondary data, from the regions that the projects were running, in terms looking at certain criteria in terms of gender, in terms of income generation, in terms of private sector involvement, in terms of income that it has generated for the farmers, in terms of who is at what value chain stage, and why we had just a little number of actors within the chain. Now we realize that funding, when we got that result, we realized that it was skewed in terms of gender. Quite a number of women were in the value chain, yet the decision making was done by the men. And we also realized that the youth, just about 20% of the youth were involved in agriculture, and the rest were all the aged. And we also realized that we didn't have enough private engagement, and funding was also an issue. We had only micro funding and then funding amongst themselves, because the funding houses did not see the agriculture as a risk area. And so based on that, we realized all the highlights as to what has to be done. And so the project decided to do a funding, a revolving fund, and then do an investment forum to highlight the different uses of the produce, and do a plan as in the financials, to be able to, for them to see the margins that they tend to get by producing what, and then the markets available. So just after that, then we realized more private sectors were coming in. So after the project was extended for additional year, to be able to see if what the strategy we adopted would really was impactful. Then we saw that in 2019, they have increased from 6 to 16. And then when we found out why, we realized that majority of them were looking at the margins that they would get from what they are producing, and they were having access to markets. And they realized that they could have raw materials with the farmers, because we had given them a lot of planting materials, improved planting materials, and they were increasing their yields, and they needed to mop up. So that is what we used in getting that. We used data and then research to come up with this. Thank you.
And we have a question in the chat. I don't know if you can see it. I'll just read it in case you can't see it. So Brad said earlier it was mentioned, so you mentioned all the different types of technology that had helped transform understanding the value chain. And he's wondering what technologies you think had the biggest impact, particularly in terms of collecting data on agriculture.
Yeah, the technology was the mobile phone, where languages, the local dialects, were transferred to the farmers, so they could hear whatever is being communicated to them in terms of the use of the fertilizer, in terms of when to use it, and in terms of markets that are available, and who is buying what. And we realized that that really helped the farmers, because every time they harvest, having market for their produce was a challenge, and that was very effective for them. And there was also another equipment that was used in measuring the GPS location of the farm, because they could tell that they have 3 acres, 4 acres, but we need to look at how much yield they get from the farm. So we use the GPS to do the coordinates, and then we compare the yield, the planting material that has been given to them, to be able to measure how much yield they were able to achieve at the end of the day, and to be able to give them the benefit they get as a result of using the improved variety. Thank you.
And if anyone else has, oh, it looks like we might have another. Oh, Brad said thank you. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to go ahead and come off mute and ask your question live. Marian, I'll admit I'm working from home today, so during part of your presentation, I got a little distracted with some domestic business. But did you? I think you may have said something about gender, women, the role of women in this process.
Yeah.
And so maybe reiterate that, or expand on any observations you may have made on the gender dynamics in this system.
Yeah. for sub-Saharan Africa, and normally when you are designing agricultural projects, you need to look at the culture, you need to look at the what women stand in that culture. And for instance, in Ghana, in the northern part of Ghana, women do not take decisions. And when there is a farm, the land belongs to the man, though it is the woman who is doing the processing, it is the woman who and the man, both of them are doing the farming, but when it comes to taking decisions, it is the man. And so when you go there and you design the project such that it is a decision taking for the woman, it would not fly. And because whatever it is, even if you give it to her, she would definitely go and give it to the man, because that is their culture, that is their belief. That's withstanding, the women are ready now. They have now understood that they need to be empowered, not necessarily not to disrespect the men, but also just to give them the economic power to be able to feed their children, pay some of their fees when the men are not around. And so it is a chicken and egg situation. We are trying to empower the women, but not to go contrary to their culture. Thank you.
Marian, thank you for your presentation. Very great. I'm Chelsea from Media Program at Vision, Michigan University. I have a question. I heard you say the private sector are the main sector to drive in this value chain. And could you expand or explain more about how the project engaged the private sector to this value chain?
Please, can you come again, please?
Yeah, can you elaborate, like explain more about how to engage the private sector to this project and to make like sustainable farming or something? Yeah, how to engage them, yeah.
Okay. You see, when we use the smallholder farmer, normally the smallholders have smaller acreages of land, and the microprocessors are processing just a little bit of it. And you see that the market demands volumes to be able to help the chain to drive. Now, when we engage the private sector, we do the financials that this is a smallholder farmer, but if you can invest in a bigger farm where you can have money to buy a bigger land, and then we give you all both you and the farmer, the training in terms of the applications of the fertilizer, we give the land preparation and all. The private sector, it's kind of babysitting the smallholder farmer to pull him along to be able to access the bigger market. And so that is how we rope in the private sector. That notwithstanding, you have the private sector to be the only one that the funding financial houses would want to give the money to, because they see that the risk there to be a little low. So now we say that, okay, the private sector would have this money, but he should have an outgrower scheme, a cluster of smallholder farmers around him, whom he will be helping by providing the input supply, by doing the land preparation for them, by providing technological advancement, I mean, in terms of giving them all the technologies that they need. Then when that is done, all those things will be costed so that at the end of the day, the farmer, when he harvests the thing, the private sector would offtake and then do the deduction of how much money he had invested in the preparation of the land. And in order not to shortchange the farmer will sell it at the prevailing market price. The prevailing market price. So that is how we rope the private sector in to be able to take advantage of the value chain.
Thank you.
Are you okay with that?
Yes, yes. Thank you.
And we have another question in the chat. Mohammed says, you mentioned PPP collaborations. Can you elaborate on that, on how that partnership is helpful to the farmers?
Yeah, PPP is a public-private partnership. I talked about the warehousing system. Yes, the government has money to build these warehouses. Bear in mind, if they want to have effective management of that warehouse, they need to get a private sector to run it. And it is this private sector who would team up with the government so that the private sector do not charge exorbitant fees for the use of the warehouse by the farmers. So the private sector teams up with the government, while the government gives subsidies to farmers or any of the value chain actors for putting goods into the warehouse. And we see that the private sector will be able to drive it because they have the muscle to record any inputs, anything that has been put there, to run and manage the whole warehousing system. In fact, even with the receipt systems, they will be in the best position to do that. And so that is what we call the PPP. So it has collaborations with a lot of private sectors. In fact, even with the mechanization centers, you have the government buying a bigger tractor, but you have the private sector also coming in to manage the use of the tractor so that it will be sustainable for the use of the farmer.
Marian, can I have in a second question?
Okay.
Yeah, in my country, like in Southeast Asia, when the farmer they grow the sweet corn, and for example, this year many farmers they grow a large amount of sweet corn, and the supplier, the buyer, they reduce the price, and they say, oh, it's because you have a lot, and we cannot buy all of the products, and they reduce the price. And do you see anything, any experience like this in Africa? And if yes, how can you deal with this?
I thank you for this. This is where you have the private sector also coming in, because when you see that there is glut, that is where you can have people investing in processing of the commodity so that it can prevent post-harvest losses. And if the private sector can easily get markets because he has his structures that he can use to assess markets both local and internationally. And so if the private sector decides that I want to go into the maize value chain, then they will do the drying, they will do the packaging, they will do the warehousing, and then keep it as it is in bumper, so that when it goes out of season, they will be able to have a year-round supply of the maize. So that is how it goes. If there is bumper, definitely any buyer would reduce the price because there are a lot chasing smaller buyers. It's a demand and supply issue. So if you have a private sector who want to help the farmer or who is looking at an opportunity within the chain, what he has to do is to mop up the surpluses and process them and store them for another market. So what he needs to do is to find out or do a research into what it can be used for in terms of the end use and how it can be processed, or what you can use to churn it out to be able to withstand some time, a shelf life. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions or comments for Marian? Okay. Apologize for our a little bit of a technical problems with our host, John, but we've muddled through. So thank you so much, Marian, for your time and your insights on this and for joining us from so far away today. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone. Thank you.